In the criminal world, there are personalities whose actions trigger fear even among the most hardened criminals. This story tells of people who have lost their humanity and moral reference points. Even in circles of the criminal elite, these people are regarded as those who have crossed the boundaries of acceptable behavior. On a sunny May day, 1967, Deborah Evans was born in Chicago, Illinois, in a religious family. Her relatives lovingly called her Debbie. As the eldest of 4 children, she grew up to be an energetic and cheerful person. However, her parents' separation left its marks on Debbie's soul, which affected her self-image. In search of emotional warmth and understanding, Debbie often felt drawn to significantly older men. Possibly she unconsciously sought the image of her father in each of them. This path led to unplanned motherhood. At 18 years old, Debbie learned that she would become a mother. In the fall of 1985, little Samantha brightened Debbie's life with new light. The young mother devoted all her time to her little one, but the relationship with the girl's father gradually became cooler and cooler. No matter how much Debbie tried to maintain this connection, all attempts remained unsuccessful. After the final separation from Samantha's father, relatives noticed changes in Debbie's behavior. The changes in her figure after childbirth and the emotional experiences of this time strongly influenced her self-confidence. Despite her inner experiences, Debbie did not give up hope of finding a life partner. She actively visited dating clubs and responded easily even to small signs of attention. Outsiders might have perceived this behavior as reckless, but her relatives understood. Debbie was simply seeking her happiness. New relationships emerged one after another. After 3 years, she had her second child, Joshua. From birth, the boy was confronted with difficulties. Problems with his spine hindered the proper development of his legs. Regular visits to the medical center became part of their life. Support from the boy's father was not to be expected. The relationship had not worked out. Debbie managed as well as she could. She lived on social benefits and with the help of relatives, especially from Samantha's father. In the year 1989, the life of a 22-year-old woman changed after meeting James Edwards, who was 24. Their story extended over 6 years. They separated but always found their way back to each other. James became an important part of their little family, although it was sometimes difficult for them to find a common language. Everything became more complicated when Laverne Ward entered her life, a young dark-skinned man who was 4 years younger than her. Deborah found herself between 2 fires, the new acquaintance and James, with whom she had a long relationship history. In the year 1994, fate gave her a gift, her son, Jordan. Deborah was convinced that Laverne was the biological father of the child. The child had inherited his dark skin color. However, this situation did not help her in choosing her life partner. During this difficult time, Deborah lived on social benefits and actively tried to find work. James appeared as the more reliable option. He had a good position, a stable income, unlike Laverne. At the end of 1994, Deborah decided to begin a new chapter and moved to a quiet area of Illinois, where she chose an apartment on the western outskirts of Edison. Gradually, she tended to decide for James. Their relationship became stronger and warmer. Even little Joshua, despite his spinal problems from birth, recovered and showed unexpected athletic activity for his age. Life seemed to be settling into calmer channels. In March 1995, James moved in with Deborah. Soon she shared the joyful news. She was expecting a child. For the future baby, she chose the name Elijah. In November 1995, 28-year-old Deborah was preparing for an important event. In the 9th month of her pregnancy, she expected the baby's arrival any day. It was planned that she would go to the hospital on the 19th of November and the doctors would help with the birth on the 20th. But fate had other plans. On the 16th of November 1995 at 17:30, James went to work. He walked. Work was very close by. The shift lasted until 2:30 at night. Upon his return, he noticed strange lighting in the room, although Deborah and the children normally slept at this time. This troubled him. Perhaps Deborah's labor had begun. As he approached the house, his unease intensified. The front door stood open. When he entered, he saw troubling traces in the kitchen. Little Jordan came toward him and seemed unusually worried. James examined the child. Physically, it was unharmed. He called for Deborah. Silence was the answer. When he looked into the bedroom, he saw her motionless figure on the bed. James noticed something strange when he saw Debbie under the blanket. Her posture seemed unnatural. At first, he thought she was teasing him as usual and pretending to sleep. But when he pulled back the blanket, the sight shocked him. 28-year-old Deborah lay motionless. Impact traces could be seen on her abdomen. In panic, James began calling the children by name, but only little Jordan responded. When he ran to 10-year-old Samantha's room, he found his daughter on the floor. She was unconscious. 8-year-old Joshua was nowhere to be seen. Without losing time, James dialed the emergency number 911. The arriving officers found the young man sitting on the floor next to Debbie. He was in a state of shock and barely understood what was happening. Again and again, he asked the police officers and paramedics about the condition of his relatives. When he learned the truth, he could not hold back his tears. The experts examined Debbie and concluded that someone had performed a kind of cesarean section with a sharp object. The newborn was not found in the apartment. 1.5-year-old Jordan was dirty but remained physically unharmed. Apparently, the little one tried to wake up Mama and sister after the incident. The whereabouts of 8-year-old Joshua remained a puzzle. The investigators immediately organized the search for the boy and began questioning the neighbors. While part of the officers spoke with the residents, specialists carefully examined the apartment and the surrounding area. During the examination of the area, large kitchen scissors with traces of the incident were found. The experts suspect that exactly this object was used by the perpetrators. The crime technicians also collected several fingerprints of the alleged perpetrators. An interesting detail was that the front door showed no traces of mechanical impact. This indicated that Deborah knew the visitor and opened the door herself. The investigators encountered an unusual case. The perpetrator had obviously observed the events in the house for a long time and waited for the moment to take the newborn. Deborah's partner was asked to the station for questioning, and necessary medical examinations were conducted with their older child. Since statistics show frequent involvement of close persons in such cases, James's alibi had to be checked. When relatives arrived for conversations with the investigators, they unanimously characterized James as an excellent person and emphasized the strong and sincere relationship of the couple. They were enthusiastically preparing for the family addition, which excluded James's involvement in the incident. From the first minutes, he actively supported the investigation, shared all known information, and voluntarily offered to undergo a lie detector test. He strived to quickly prove his non-involvement so that the investigation could focus on searching for the real perpetrator. The relatives shared important information about Deborah's former partner, Laverne Ward, the biological father of 1.5-year-old Jordan and member of a local criminal group. It turned out that Laverne showed uncontrolled behavior during their relationship, used violence, and restricted Deborah's freedom. She tried several times to obtain a court order against his approach, but Laverne convinced her each time not to do it. Shortly before the incident, however, she managed to obtain a restraining order. Deborah's sisters told that the couple finally separated 7 to 8 months ago when Laverne was last seen. Despite the separation, he periodically appeared in Debbie's life. Those close to her were not deeply informed about the details of their relationship, but the sisters mentioned that Deborah maintained contact with Laverne's family and brought little Jordan to them. Unfortunately, no one knew the Ward family, except for a pregnant cousin of Laverne, whose name could not be remembered. James, Deborah's current partner, confirmed the difficult character of her communication with Laverne and noted that she was glad about the end of this relationship. However, the shared child forced the former partners to maintain contact. During the investigation of the crime scene, the investigators discovered several objects that belonged to neither James nor Deborah. Some personal belongings of the young man were missing. A number of the found objects were sent to experts for examination. The statements of the neighbors helped confirm the credibility of James's words and provided important information about Laverne. Employers and colleagues finally confirmed the whereabouts of Debbie's boyfriend. He indeed spent the entire evening at the sorting center. Although none of the residents could name a specific perpetrator, a young woman noticed a suspicious group near the house in the evening: 2 dark-skinned men and 1 Latin American. When a resident asked about the reason for their presence, the group disappeared hastily. Specially trained dogs were used to search for 8-year-old Joshua and the infant. The animals repeatedly stopped at one point, which indicated the children were taken away by car in a northern direction from Deborah's apartment complex. According to one of the sisters, Laverne explained his rights to the future child to Debbie in August of the same year and insisted on her handing over the baby to him. Deborah rejected his demands and skillfully insisted that James was the father of the child. The sister also shared that Debbie complained about Laverne's intrusive attention 2 days before the incident. He followed her on the streets, showered her with insults, and tried to provoke an argument. During this time, Deborah became seriously concerned about her safety and planned to obtain a temporary restraining order, which was later also issued. Given previous incidents involving violence, Laverne's criminal record, and his connections to criminal groups, he was of particular interest to the investigation. Since Laverne's whereabouts remained unknown, the investigators decided to contact his last girlfriend, Cynthia Sawyer. During a house visit to Cynthia, neither she nor the sought person were to be found. The homeowner shared that he had not seen Laverne for a long time, but gave hints on how to find Cynthia for a conversation and allowed the search of the apartment. After nothing substantial was found, the officers immediately set out to search for Cynthia. After a long search, they succeeded in finding an important witness. She shared that she maintains contact with the suspect because of a shared child. According to her words, Laverne came to a correctional facility shortly before the incident because of the distribution of prohibited substances. Cynthia told an interesting detail. Debbie insisted that Laverne was not the biological father of the future child. However, the young man himself was convinced of the opposite and showed extraordinary interest in the future child. After the tragic events with Deborah, Laverne contacted Cynthia by phone and threatened her with similar consequences in case of disobedience. Cynthia had no doubts about Laverne's involvement in what happened. She reported he might be staying with his 30-year-old acquaintance, Laura Pamey. The woman explained how to find this place and shared all known information about the relatives of the main suspect. Through this, the investigators obtained a reliable source of information about the young man's personality. The suspect was not found at the indicated location, but Cynthia named another possible address. The homeowner was Martha Martin, who had recently become Laverne's aunt through marriage to his uncle. But here too the search remained unsuccessful. Martha allowed the search of her nephew's room, but nothing substantial was found. The residents also could not share any meaningful information. The medical examination revealed peculiarities of what happened. Samantha's neck area was injured. The experts determined that she tried to defend herself. It was assumed that she was a random eyewitness. In Deborah, the experts found a small metallic object. Particular attention was drawn to Deborah's abdomen, through which the baby was removed. Presumably, the scissors found nearby were used. The examination showed traces of the infant. The question arose about its condition after such an emergency procedure. According to medical data, in such situations, there are only a few minutes to save the child. This pointed to the necessity of professional medical skills and precise actions. The specialists suspected that in such a situation one could not manage without helpers, which brought up the thought of the involvement of several people. The medical examination showed a shocking fact. During the emergency situation, the main figure of the story was conscious when the child was taken from her. the experts concluded that an entire group was at work. Alone, such a thing was practically impossible to carry out. Several people were needed to hold down the woman. The specialists confirmed the investigators' original assumptions after examining all details of the incident. Laverne had accomplices. He did not act alone. This explained many inconsistencies in this complicated case. An important moment emerged in the witness's memory. Near the house at this time was a group of 3 people, 2 African Americans and 1 Latin American. The description was very reminiscent of Laverne's circle. Such incidents occur extremely rarely in the practice of law enforcement agencies. Usually in such cases, a woman acts who cannot have children. She decides on a desperate step to appropriate someone else's child. In this situation, there was much that was unclear. But one thing was obvious. The perpetrator tried to protect the infant. The mystery of the disappearance of 8-year-old Joshua remained unsolved. The motives for the disappearance of both children, his and little Elijah, remained unclear. The visit to the school that the older boy attended and the conversation with the social worker revealed disturbing details from Deborah's life. It turned out that James was aggressive toward her. There were witness statements that he also treated the schoolboy badly. Although Joshua's whereabouts could not be determined, the investigators had reason to assume that James might be involved in the incident. On the 18th of November 1995, around noon, an unexpected call came to the police station. A man from the neighboring town, which was 10 minutes away, shared important information. When he saw the photo of missing Joshua in the news, he recognized him immediately. His girlfriend Patrice Scott had recently looked after a very similar-looking child. At the time of the call, however, the child had already been picked up by an acquaintance of Patrice. The man shared details. In the night, a dark-skinned man and a woman, whom they had never met before, knocked on her window. They brought an 8-year-old boy with the explanation that his mother had been harmed in a failed deal with prohibited substances and asked to look after him. The next day, the strangers came back to pick up the child. The investigators were immediately interested in this information and organized a meeting with Patrice, who confirmed the story. She described the companion of the dark-skinned man named Laverne. It was a certain Jacqueline. The young woman seemed troubled and explained her behavior with a recent delivery, which is why she could not take care of the student. Joshua spent that night under Patrice's supervision. In the night, the boy woke up from a nightmare and told a disturbing story. 4 strangers entered through the bedroom window to his mother. He described the frightening events of that night and mentioned his sister and his unborn brother. Patrice suspected it was only a bad dream, but later recognized the reality of what happened. The next day, Jacqueline and Fidel picked up the boy. The woman also mentioned that she noticed unusual stains on Jacqueline's dress. Following Patrice's directions, the police set out on the group's suspected path. After 20 minutes, they reached the town of Maywood. In one of the alleys, even before Jacqueline's suspected house, they found Joshua, who was already lying motionless. The medical examination revealed similar injury patterns in the boy and his relatives. Jacqueline, Laverne, and Fidel were not found at the address given by Patrice. They had disappeared. The police officers returned to the suspect's last known whereabouts, where his acquaintance Laura lived. Upon a renewed search of the suspect's room, the investigators found nothing substantial. However, the conversation with Laura shed light on the complicated relationship between Deborah and Laverne. It turned out that Deborah, when she maintained a close relationship with Laverne, convinced him of his paternity of the future child. The picture changed when she resumed contact with James. Then the story sounded completely different. This behavior repeated several times, which increasingly angered Laverne. Over time, his attitude toward his former lover became extremely negative. Presumably, Deborah used this tactic to retain the attention of both partners. The information from Laura helped the investigators pick up the trail to the main suspect. The questioning of witnesses helped create a portrait of Jacqueline. She proved to be an ordinary woman, daughter of Martha Martin, who had married Laverne's uncle, thus creating their family connection. Jacqueline's fate was not simple. An early pregnancy forced her to drop out of school, prevented education, and finding appropriate work. At 20 years old, she was already raising 3 children, which led her to the decision about a medical procedure to avoid further pregnancies. Low intellectual abilities complicated job searching. To support the family, she began committing small offenses, as the support was insufficient. Frequent conflicts with partners made her accustomed to aggressive behavior. In her biography, there were cases of arrests and stays in correctional institutions. At the time of the described events, she was 27. Martha still could not comprehend how her daughter could have gotten into such a situation. Fidel grew up in particularly difficult circumstances. His mother and grandmother had psychological problems, paranoia, schizophrenia, had strange beliefs. His childhood passed in an atmosphere unusual for a normal person. As a result, he became a typical representative of a problematic environment. From the beginning of the relationship with Fidel, Jacqueline showed a tendency toward manipulations. She engaged in voodoo practices to gain control over her partner. After some rituals, their communication took on an unusual character. She forced him to perform strange actions, believing in their magical power to strengthen her influence. During disputes, she lost control. Once she even steered her car toward Fidel's acquaintances because of suspicion of a romantic relationship. Despite the difficulties, she obtained medical qualifications and the right to work as a nursing assistant. This fact became an important element in understanding how certain medical manipulations were performed using scissors. The story of this couple began unusually. Fidel, who was 6 years younger than Jacqueline, dreamed of becoming a father. His particular wish was a child with light skin. Jacqueline, although she did not plan to have more children, decided to support her beloved's dream. A year before the incident, Jacqueline surprisingly announced her pregnancy. This news caused amazement among many, given her previous medical procedures. Nevertheless, external signs indicated her condition. Even her belly became more visible. During this time, she began actively seeking contact with expectant mothers. Her behavior raised questions. She frequently changed the expected due date, referring to medical errors. Remarkable was that Jacqueline quickly lost interest in pregnant friends when she learned they were expecting a girl. Gradually, the picture of her intentions became clearer. Apparently, she had long harbored a plan to obtain someone else's child, necessarily a boy with light skin. Elijah, whom Deborah was expecting, fit these criteria perfectly. It was exactly him that Laverne pointed to. Tina, Jacqueline's sister, later reported to investigators about her sister's alleged delivery. Although the entire family doubted the reality of this pregnancy, Jacqueline insisted on her version of events. It became obvious that little Elijah was in the hands of this couple. Hope arose to find the child. The investigators obtained the necessary documents for the arrest. At the address given by the sister, Jacqueline was not to be found. The neighbor allowed the officers to stay and wait for the couple's return. Soon, Jacqueline appeared with an infant in her arms. At the wheel sat Fidel, who wore a sweater that matched the description of the one that had disappeared from Deborah's house. Jacqueline presented birth documents for the child, whom she called Fidel Jr. The child was immediately taken to a medical facility for examination. The couple was arrested for genetic testing. When this news spread, Patrice again contacted the investigators, stating that she had additional information. She reported that her concern arose immediately when Joshua was handed over to her. He wore a soiled jacket but no shoes and pants, which seemed strange. The next day, when Jacqueline came to pick up Joshua, Patrice began asking questions about the noticed peculiarities. In response, Jacqueline unexpectedly explained to Joshua that he had to take medication. Joshua was genuinely surprised and said he did not take medication. Nevertheless, the young woman insisted. After taking the unknown preparation, Joshua felt sick. Realizing that Joshua could tell everything, the group brought him to Jacqueline's house. In the laundry room, they used an electrical cable. After that, Jacqueline acted particularly decisively and used a sharp object. The news that Elijah was safe became a glimmer of hope in this grim story. Patrice explained that she had initially concealed the information from law enforcement agencies out of serious concerns for her own safety. She had been threatened with serious consequences if she disclosed it. Laverne behaved arrogantly during interrogation and emphasized that he would never harm a child. He also denied involvement of Jacqueline and her boyfriend Fidel in the incident. After long negotiations, the suspect agreed to help with the investigation. According to his words, he had met Jacqueline and Fidel on the day of the incident, but did not know their current whereabouts. Fidel rejected all accusations. Jacqueline tried to explain the appearance of the little one with a story of how she had registered at the hospital under a false name without insurance, where allegedly a woman had handed her an abandoned child. However, genetic testing confirmed that the child was Deborah's son. All three were charged with serious accusations for actions against Deborah, Samantha, and Joshua, as well as for unlawful detention of Joshua and Elijah under aggravating circumstances. During the investigation, the origin of the firearm was clarified. They obtained it through an acquaintance, allegedly for self-protection when buying prohibited preparations. The scale of what had happened and the number of people involved shocked even experienced investigators. After Elijah's recovery, Deborah's father assumed guardianship for him and Jordan. The man dedicated his life to raising his grandchildren. Later, the investigators determined that Jacqueline had faked a pregnancy and carefully planned her actions. Laverne, who harbored a grudge against his ex, gave her the plan. Fidel became an accidental participant in their scheme. That evening, Laverne at 20 years old, Jacqueline at 28 years old, and Fidel at 22 years old came to Deborah's apartment. The hostess let the uninvited guests in. Laverne offered her a deal: $2,000 in exchange for the child for Jacqueline. Deborah categorically refused. Later it turned out they did not even have that much money. It was only a ruse. According to the case files, events developed rapidly. Fidel Café used violence and then used a sharp object. After that, they went into the room of 10-year-old Samantha. Meanwhile, Jacqueline performed emergency surgery and saved the child, who soon raised his voice. She quickly washed and dressed the infant. After taking him and Joshua, the group left the apartment and left Jordan alone behind. Evidence was found in various places. The sharp kitchen object was found in Jacqueline's dishwasher. A sheet with traces found several blocks from the crime scene matched a set from Jacqueline's house. On many objects, meat scissors, a cord, an elastic bandage, jackets, experts found biological traces. The DNA test confirmed Laverne's paternity of both boys. The court found Jacqueline and Fidel guilty on all charges with maximum sentences. Laverne was also found guilty, but the jurors considered the evidence insufficient for the maximum sentence. He was sentenced to life imprisonment. In the year 2003, the governor of Illinois commuted the maximum sentences to life imprisonment without possibility of early release. In the year 2012, Jacqueline filed an application for sentence reduction. She wrote about her improvement and the desire to return to her family, to 3 children and 6 grandchildren. The woman missed simple joys, the scent of flowers and family embraces. She claimed the confession was obtained through deception. When she was exhausted, someone had presented her with an unread document to sign. The application was rejected. Before the introduction of modern DNA analysis methods and the creation of criminal databases, the work of law enforcement was much more difficult. Today, thanks to technological advances, new investigative tools have been created. Now persons who hid among ordinary citizens for years come into the focus of justice, and no one will escape responsibility. On Saturday, the 14th of January 1995, the Edwards family planned to gather. Saturday family dinners were an unshakable tradition. These meetings were attended by the parents and their two daughters. Precisely for this reason, the absence of one of the twin sisters named Mary immediately caused concern. The 31-year-old lady did not come to the meeting and did not answer calls when relatives tried to contact her from the restaurant. Finally, patience was exhausted and all three relatives made their way to the house where Mary was living at that time. The events took place in Beaumont, state of Texas. The mother immediately sensed misfortune when she discovered the unlocked entrance door. When they went inside, they heard the sound of water, but no one answered their calls. In the bathroom, everything was flooded with water, and Mary was there in a disturbing condition. Allison, Mary's sister, immediately called the police. She reported that she had come to her sister's house and discovered that something had happened to her. The women were twins, born and raised in Texas. They were the only children of the Edwards family, and the incident with one of them became a real shock. The sisters were always inseparable, constantly together from childhood. The sisters both chose pedagogical education after school and began teaching afterwards. The twins even worked in the same educational institution. The Edwards sisters looked so similar that both students and colleagues constantly confused them. Mary was 31 when the misfortune happened. The students loved Mary very much. Many felt a special connection to her. Hundreds of students, relatives and friends of the talented teacher came to the farewell. For many of her charges, she became a real support, especially for those who grew up under difficult conditions. Parents appealed to law representatives and demanded that the guilty party be found. People were shocked by the circumstances of the incident. The situation indicated desperate resistance. Characteristic traces of self-defense remained on the hands. Apparently, the unpleasant incident began in the bedroom. This was indicated by traces on the bedding. Most likely, Mary knew the intruder as no signs of a break-in were found. The city residents knew the teacher well and worked willingly with the investigators, with the desire to find the person who was capable of such an act. Initially, they checked the close circle of acquaintances, suspected personal motives, given the nature of the incident and the absence of break-in traces. At first, it was thought the cause was submersion in water, but the medical examination showed an insufficient amount of liquid in the airways. Presumably, it got there later. The true cause was the interruption of air supply. When examining the apartment, particularly the bathroom and bedroom, the investigators discovered numerous important pieces of evidence. Particularly disturbing was the discovery: handcuffs of the Smith & Wesson brand. These handcuffs looked like professional police equipment. The law enforcement officers were confused. Possibly the perpetrator had a connection to the police or to security services. It was not excluded that colleagues might know him personally. For this reason, the case was taken particularly seriously by all participants in the investigation. In the following weeks, the investigators tried to trace the serial number of the handcuffs, however, without success. At this point, David Perry, Mary's former partner, became the main suspect. Despite her attractiveness and pleasant character, she had a limited circle of acquaintances and few close relationships. Mary was completely absorbed in her work and the care of her students. Little time remained for her private life. It turned out that only David Perry could have the keys to the teacher's house. There was a theory about a possibly complicated separation. It was suspected that he might stalk his ex-partner, come uninvited and act out of jealousy or revenge. However, none of these assumptions found confirmation. DNA traces were found at the crime scene. The suspect voluntarily provided material for the examination. While they waited for the results, the investigators spoke with mutual acquaintances of the couple. Everyone described David as a harmless person who was not capable of aggressive actions. Moreover, David Perry presented irrefutable proof of his whereabouts at the time of the incident. The young man cooperated willingly with the investigation, provided biological samples without objections, and did not give the impression of a person connected to the case. He had no criminal record, unpleasant incidents, or inappropriate behavior in his past. He was definitively excluded by the expertise. The genetic material did not match. The former partner was removed from the list of suspects. Unfortunately, progress in the case came to a standstill at this point. Other acquaintances of the victim did not fit the description of the perpetrator and had reliable alibis. The investigators had many materials to examine. However, the possibilities of expertise and the technologies of that time were limited. The fruitless investigation dragged on for many years. Changes occurred only after 23 years, in the year 2018, when a method for analyzing genetic material using genealogy appeared. Thanks to the search for matches among relatives of the alleged perpetrator, it was possible to significantly expand the circle of possible matches. The law enforcement agencies turned to the GetMatch program, which collected genetic data and created lists of Americans who voluntarily provided samples. Thus, a large database was created that was available to authorities for checking old unsolved cases. When investigator Brandon Bess was suggested to check an old unsolved case with the help of this program, he immediately remembered Mary Edwards. This investigation had given him no peace all these years. Finally, in April 2020, the samples collected at the teacher's crime scene were sent to a laboratory outside Houston. There it was possible to find numerous matches with alleged relatives of the perpetrator who were at least distantly connected to him. Thus began the creation of the family tree. Unfortunately, the list of names for analysis and comparison proved to be enormous, several thousand persons. At this moment, the investigator's wife joined the investigation. This dedicated woman devoted her free time to studying the matches from the list. The work required exceptional attention. Each person had to be evaluated without error. Parallel to this, the researchers turned to the personal records of Mary Edwards, which she had kept for many years. There was a theory about a possible obsessive admirer who could harm her due to rejected feelings. Although the records were thoroughly examined after the incident, no significant clues were found there. Now it was decided to match the names mentioned in the diaries with the persons from the emerging genealogical family tree. In this phase, the family name Lapointe began to stand out. Several matches emerged. It turned out that the first discovered relative of the sought person was named Shara Lapointe. Shara had worked in this field for decades and possessed rich experience with similarly complex cases. Earlier, she had succeeded in establishing the identity of one of the women who were found along Highway number 45 in the well-known case of the Texas Fields. After gathering experience and achieving successes, Shara was ready to share her knowledge to help solve other mysteries, including the case of Mary Edwards. The new participant agreed to help, despite the possibility of discovering unpleasant truths about her relatives. During the investigation, the specialist checked even her own relatives with concern, as she understood the possible consequences. It was necessary to examine about 7.5 thousand names. The analysis of each person on the list proceeded slowly. Information had to be gathered not only about them themselves, but also about their family. All information was carefully processed before being included in the scheme or excluded. Several hours of work were needed for each person. Thus, 3 months passed in which the investigators and Shara Point devoted all their free time to searching for the perpetrator. Finally, an interesting match was discovered. They came across a married couple from Vermont who qualified as relatives of the sought person according to all criteria. These people had raised 2 sons who attended Forest Park School, the same one that Mary had once attended. Now the law enforcement agencies had 2 main suspects, Michael and Clayton Foreman. The first one fit poorly age-wise, and when checked, no violations or signs of aggression were found. Michael was almost immediately crossed off the list. With his brother, the situation looked different. It turned out that Clayton had gone to school with Mary Edward in the upper grades with a small age difference. Furthermore, the man had a previous court record that made him a suitable suspect. As it turned out, in 1981, a young woman had approached the police and reported an unpleasant incident with Clayton Foreman. The circumstances of the incident resembled in many ways the case with the teacher that happened almost 15 years later. The difference was only that the first victim remained alive. She had also attended Forest Park School. The young man worked at that time as manager of the football team. The incident could be diffused. For this incident, Clayton received only a suspended sentence and a fine. Unfortunately, at that time, police databases with DNA samples did not yet exist, which is why he did not have to provide biological material. For exactly this reason, he was not identified during the investigation of the incident with the teacher. Clayton had a relationship with Mary's friend named Diana Coe. They had already been together for 3 years before the incident and were planning their wedding. The young woman described him as a pleasant person, but obviously did not know him particularly well. Less than 3 months remained until the marriage when Diana learned about his inappropriate behavior, the suspended sentence, and the fine, after which she wanted to break off the engagement. Nevertheless, the skillful manipulator managed to convince her that everything was just a misunderstanding, and that woman had slandered him. Clayton avoided this topic but created a quite credible story. Diana was so excited about the upcoming celebration that she believed her chosen one. The couple married despite the warnings from Diana's relatives. Diana and Clayton lived together for a little more than 11 years, and they had a son. According to the woman's statement, her husband constantly lied about financial difficulties which he did not lack. In addition, she noticed his unhealthy preference for police handcuffs and special equipment of law enforcement officers. He even transported these handcuffs on the rearview mirror in his car. At the time of the incident with Mary, Diana had already ended the relationship with Clayton, but remembered how she called her ex-husband and tearfully told him about what had happened. The woman was shocked by his indifferent reaction. He simply continued the conversation as if nothing had happened, and then ended the call. Now it became understandable why he showed no compassion. Presumably he was connected to this incident. At this time, the person of interest to the investigation was 60 years old. He no longer lived in Beaumont, but his traces led to the small town of Reynoldsburg in the state of Gaia, with about 40,000 inhabitants. At this time, Clayton earned his living as an Uber driver. The investigators succeeded in determining his whereabouts and gathering the necessary information. Now it was necessary to obtain biological material for analysis. The house of the main suspect was placed under surveillance. A local police officer practically confiscated his bag of household waste, which was then taken to a specialized laboratory. Here, the experts discovered traces on a beer bottle. The comparison with the materials from the incident with Mary Edwards showed an almost complete match. Now a conversation with the suspect lay ahead. The lead investigators traveled to Gaia and devised a clever plan. Since Clayton worked as a taxi driver, they decided to invite him to a conversation about an allegedly lost item of a customer. On the 29th of April 2021, they succeeded under this pretext in getting him to visit the police station. The man voluntarily agreed to come to talk about a lost wallet. Finally, 26 years after the incident with Mary, the allegedly involved person was in the interrogation room. Here, the investigators revealed the true purpose of the meeting: the investigation of the case of Mary Edwards from 1995. This obviously shocked Clayton, but he tried to remain calm and initially even denied knowing her. Then they showed him a wedding photo in which his first wife could be seen. In the picture, Diana could be seen next to Mary and her twin sister, who served as bridesmaids. This information helped him remember. Clayton confirmed that Mary had indeed been at his wedding in 1982, invited by his wife. From the first minutes of the conversation, the man began to show unrest, and the investigators quickly cornered him with a series of questions. After discovering inconsistencies, the investigators decided to press on his weak point, hoping to obtain a confession. The suspect claimed not to have even known about the incident with Mary and never to have been in her house. In these statements, they immediately noticed contradictions, especially after the words of his former wife, who called Clayton when she learned the news about the incident with Mary, despite the facts. Clayton denied any connection with the victim and obviously used this as a protective mechanism. He also denied an intimate relationship with her, which turned out to be another untruth. His biological traces were found on her personal items. Naturally, Clayton was confused when the officers asked how his DNA could have ended up on Mary's underwear and her bed. When Clayton was finally cornered, he demanded a lawyer and ended the conversation with the investigators. The man was arrested. Symbolically, Clayton Foreman was shackled with the same handcuffs that had been found on Mary Edwards in 1995. On the 12th of March 2024, 29 years had passed since the incident with the teacher. It was assumed that no difficulties would arise in this case, since the almost complete DNA match left the lawyer no room for maneuver. Weak attempts to invoke the long-past time brought no result. Clayton Foreman continued to remain stubbornly silent, did not confess his involvement, and refused to testify in his defense in court. For everyone involved in the investigation and those who sympathized with Mary, this trial was very emotional. Shera Point worried that the family would hate her for her help in Clayton's arrest. Shirla was particularly concerned about maintaining her relationship with Diana, because she had actually separated the father from their shared little ones. However, she encountered understanding and even concern for her safety before the upcoming hearings. Shirla herself regarded it as her duty to get to the bottom of the truth in this cold-blooded incident, regardless of possible consequences. Among the most important prosecution witnesses appeared the twin sister of the main character of this story, who looked amazingly similar to her. She described with bitterness how Clayton had taken the closest person in life from her. Even after 3 decades, there existed a startling resemblance between her and Mary's photograph. During the course of the trial, specialists in genealogy and genetics played a crucial role on the prosecution side. Together with other experts from the forensic laboratory, they explained modern methods of DNA analysis to the jurors. It was necessary to convince the jury members of the reliability and accuracy of the techniques for matching with relatives to identify involved persons. Special attention was devoted to the women who had been confronted with Clayton's unpleasant actions. A former employee appeared first. She reported the strange preference for attributes of law enforcement officers that was noticed at the defendant's workplace. As his subordinate who dealt with documents, every time she opened the drawer of her supervisor's desk, she discovered a pair of handcuffs there. The secretary was confused but did not dare to ask about it and considered it an eccentricity of Clayton. There were no alarming signals, although the woman could not precisely explain the purpose of handcuffs at the workplace. The defendant's last life partner told of discovering many inappropriate recordings with young persons. When she asked him about it, Clayton replied unmoved that he needed them for his fantasies about inappropriate actions. Later, he explained the situation as a failed joke, and the incident remained without further consequences. In the following years, no similar inclinations were observed in him. In the trial, a young woman appeared who had been affected by his actions shortly before Clayton's wedding. Diana was present at the trial, supported the prosecution, and believed in the guilt of her former husband. There she heard for the first time the report of the victims and recognized Clayton's true nature. Nevertheless, she noticed that during their 11 years of shared life, he had not shown similar behavior toward her. He had special preferences in the intimate area, including the use of handcuffs, but did not cross permissible boundaries in family relationships. At the trial spoke the first person affected by Clayton's actions, who described what had happened in detail. She was 19 when the incident happened. Some months before Clayton's wedding to Diana, she was driving home late in the evening on a country road and got stuck with her vehicle. Unexpectedly, a car stopped next to her, from which a man got out who introduced himself as an employee of law enforcement agencies. He offered help, and the young woman agreed, as she saw no other way out. The perpetrator took advantage of the moment when she left the vehicle. He restricted her movements, brought out a sharp object, and threatened serious consequences in case of resistance. The young woman was seized by horror. After the incident, Clayton unexpectedly changed his behavior and even brought her home. In doing so, he asked her not to be troubled and tried to calm her. He said that he regretted what had happened and claimed not to want to cause harm. This abrupt mood change seemed strange and frightening compared to the aggressive behavior he had shown some minutes before. The victim filed a report with law enforcement agencies but feared possible consequences. In court, she said that she bore no grudge against the attacker and had forgiven him. The young woman did not want to harm Clayton, as she believed he was sincerely remorseful and would not break the law again. Precisely for this reason, he received such a mild sentence. Now, the first victim blamed herself because if he had ended up behind bars, this could have prevented the incident with the teacher. Besides her, another woman appeared in the trial who had become a victim of the defendant. She had not approached the authorities at all earlier out of fear. The woman turned out to be an old school acquaintance of Diana Kuhl. According to her words, Clayton attacked her on an ordinary evening. The incident occurred in the year 1986 when she lived alone. The young woman was friends with Diana, which is why she occasionally also had dealings with Clayton. He always seemed like a normal person until he revealed his true nature. One evening, he came to her home, told of financial difficulties and marital problems. Clayton seemed convincing and said he needed someone who would listen to him and understand without judgment. The young woman believed him and let him into the apartment. As soon as she turned around, he attacked, held a weapon to the back of her head, threatened her, and forced her to intimacy against her will. In doing so, he also used handcuffs. After everything, Clayton, according to the victim's statement, became strangely milder and asked for forgiveness. Then he simply left and asked her not to go to the police. Diana's acquaintance did not dare to file a report, and later, Clayton completely broke off contact with her. It seems that the teacher, unlike other victims, tried to resist the perpetrator, who put his threats into action. The prosecution's witness statements were presented over 7 days. The defense presented not a single witness. The lawyer claimed that although Clayton might possibly have violated women's personal boundaries, there was no convincing evidence for his involvement in the more serious incident. Presumably, he simply had no other defense strategies available. The statements confirmed all earlier incidents with other women. Clayton indeed showed no aggression or cruelty toward his wives, with the exception of a special preference for handcuffs. The defender insisted that despite all statements, Clayton's involvement in the incident with Mary Edwards could not be proven beyond reasonable doubt. After hearing the closing arguments, the jurors withdrew for deliberation. They needed only 1 hour for their decision, as the prosecution's arguments had sounded more convincing from the beginning. Clayton Foreman was found guilty and subsequently sentenced to life imprisonment with the possibility of early release after 30 years. According to the jurors, they were convinced of the defendant's guilt even without the statements of the affected women. When the investigators and geneticists spoke about the almost complete match of the DNA with the samples from Clayton Foreman, all doubts disappeared for most jurors. The specialists provided such a detailed explanation of the principles of modern investigation methods that their words sounded irrefutable. The defendant himself denied his involvement in what happened until the end, despite all evidence. Naturally, against this background, he revealed no details about his reprehensible act. However, even more disturbing questions remained open. For many years, Clayton masterfully managed to hide his true nature from his surroundings, even from the companions with whom he shared his home. Most people from his circle of acquaintances did not even suspect anything of his inclination to impermissible actions. In this connection, the investigative authorities suspected his involvement in a much larger number of unsolved incidents. Clayton Foreman is serving his sentence in a state correctional facility. The possibility of early release will only present itself to him in the year 2061, if he even experiences this time. At that point, he would have to be 101 years old.